Hi, I'm Michelle and today I'm going to read you a story called Mrs. Smith's Crocodile by Linda Dearsley and Frank Rogers. Are we ready? Mrs. Smith wanted a pet. In fact, Mrs. Smith already had a pet. She had a budgie that flew around the room when you opened its cage. But Mrs. Smith was bored with the budgie. She wanted something more exciting. So one day she went out and bought a baby crocodile. The crocodile was no bigger than a ruler. It was covered in greeny brown scales, and when it opened its mouth, you could see 2 rows of tiny white teeth. "Ah, isn't he sweet?" said Mrs. Smith. "I'll call him Sweetie Pie." Mrs. Smith took the crocodile home and let him swim in the sink. Mrs. Smith's grandson Robert came to look at him, and when he put his hand out to stroke the crocodile, Sweetie Pie bit him. "Grandma, your crocodile's just bit me," he cried. "Nonsense," said Mrs. Smith. "I expect you scratched your hand in the garden. Sweetie Pie wouldn't hurt a fly." And it was strange that she should say that, because from the day the crocodile arrived, there was never a single fly or spider or creepy crawly of any kind in Mrs. Smith's house. Mrs. Smith was very fond of Sweetie Pie. She made him a bed out of a shoebox with tiny blankets and a tiny pillow. She took him for walks on a tiny lead, and since she couldn't find any crocodile food in the pet shop, she fed him dog food and cat food with a bit of fish stirred in. And Sweetie Pie grew. He grew too big for the shoebox, so Mrs. Smith got him a crate. He grew too big for the sink, so she gave him the bath. And she had to swap his tiny lead for a large lead. One day, when Robert came to visit, he let the budgie fly round the room. Sweetie Pie watched the budgie, then he opened his mouth, and as the budgie flew by, he swallowed it whole. "Grandma," shouted Robert, "your crocodile's just eaten the budgie." "Nonsense," said Mrs. Smith. "I expect the budgie's just flown out of the window. Sweetie Pie wouldn't hurt a fly." And Sweetie Pie smiled. He had a large smile exposing 50 shiny white teeth. "Tweet, tweet," he said. And still the crocodile grew. He grew too big for the crate, so Mrs. Smith gave him her bed. He grew too big for the bath, so she built him a pond in the garden, and she had to swap the large lead for a chain. One day, when Sweetie Pie was lazing in the pond, the cat next door came into the garden. Sweetie Pie watched the cat, and then he opened his mouth, and as the cat walked by, he swallowed it whole. "Mrs. Smith," cried the woman next door, "your crocodile's just eaten my cat." "Nonsense," said Mrs. Smith. "I expect your cat's just gone indoors. Sweetie Pie wouldn't hurt a fly." And Sweetie Pie smiled. He had a very large smile exposing 100 white teeth. "Meow," he said. And still the crocodile grew. He grew too big for the bed, so he slept in the hall. He grew too big for the pond, so Mrs. Smith watered him with the hose, and she had to swap the chain for a tow rope. One day when they were in the park, A dog bounced over chasing a ball. Sweetie Pie watched the dog. Then he opened his mouth as the dog went by and swallowed it whole. "Hey!" shouted the dog's owner. "Your crocodile's just eaten my dog." "Nonsense," said Mrs. Smith. "I expect your dog has just run away. Sweetie Pie wouldn't hurt a fly." And Sweetie Pie smiled. He had an enormous smile exposing 200 shiny white teeth. "Woof!" he said. He still grew. He grew too big for the hall, so he slept with his head out of the front door and his tail out of the back door. He grew too big to get out into the garden, so Mrs. Smith had to just wipe him over with a damp cloth, and she couldn't take him for a walk at all. One day, Mrs. Smith's grandson Robert came for tea. "Grandma," he called, but there was no answer. There was no one there but Sweetie Pie. And Sweetie Pie smiled the biggest smile you've ever seen. "Wouldn't hurt a fly," he said. Then he opened his mouth and Robert ran. The end. Hope you enjoyed the story. Thanks for listening. Bye bye.